It began with silence. A silence so heavy that even the crickets in the grass and the wind that usually swept through the valley seemed to have been smothered. And for anyone passing through the lonely backroads of West Virginia that night, the small town of Marowak appeared perfectly normal from a distance, its dim streetlights glowing faintly against the fog. But when I drove in after midnight, I realized something was terribly wrong because there were no moving cars, no open shops, and not a single soul walking the streets, as if the town had gone to sleep and forgotten to wake up. And at first I thought it was odd but harmless, until I noticed every single front door was wide open, as though the people inside had all risen at the same moment and stepped out into the night without returning. And the houses looked abandoned, but not in the way old places do. They looked freshly emptied, cups of coffee still steaming on tables, televisions flickering on blank channels, and one car still idling in a driveway with its driver's door swung open. I called out just to hear my voice echo back at me. "Hello? Anyone here?" But the only answer was the distant creak of a swing moving on its own in the playground across from the church, and my chest tightened because the air felt wrong, thick, and heavy with something I could not name, and I could smell smoke faintly, though there was no fire to be seen. I parked my car in front of the diner where the neon sign still buzzed weakly, and when I stepped inside, I froze because the booths were full of unfinished meals, forks left halfway to mouths that were no longer there, coffee still warm in mugs, and a jukebox humming low though no one had touched it. And I swear I felt the pressure of eyes on me, though the room was empty, so empty that my footsteps seemed to echo too loudly. I walked through slowly, calling out again, but my voice cracked with unease, and that was when I noticed all the clocks, every single one on the walls and behind the counter, even the watches that had been left on tables, were frozen at exactly 12:03, and a chill rolled down my spine because it was 12:37 by my own phone, and I knew something had happened here, something that tore through the entire town in a single moment. I left the diner and moved toward the church on the hill, and with each step the feeling of being followed grew stronger, though whenever I turned, there was nothing but the fog curling around the empty streets. And then I heard it, faint at first, like whispers carried on the air, hundreds of voices overlapping as if the whole town was speaking at once from some hidden place. And my breath hitched because the words were not clear, but I could make out certain phrases like, "Come with us," and "The bell is calling." And when I looked toward the church, I saw the bell tower looming in the fog, its rusted bell swaying though there was no wind, clanging softly, too softly, almost like a heartbeat echoing through the valley. I wanted to leave right then. My instincts screamed at me to get back in my car and drive until the town was a memory behind me. But curiosity or something darker pulled me forward. And as I climbed the steps to the church, I realized the doors were not just open. They were ripped wide, splintered at the hinges, as though something inside had forced its way out. And when I stepped across the threshold, I immediately wished I had not. The pews were overturned, hymnals scattered, and candles burned down to wax puddles on the floor. But the most horrifying thing was the mural above the altar. One I knew could not have been there before because the paint looked fresh and dripping, and it depicted a figure towering over the town with empty sockets for eyes and hands stretched wide, strings of people hanging from them like puppets, their mouths open in screams. And in the center of its chest was a bell painted in dark crimson, the same shape as the one above in the tower. And I felt my throat tighten because the whispers around me grew louder, no longer outside but inside the church itself, circling me, filling my head until I staggered back and nearly fell. I stumbled outside and realized the fog was thicker, heavier, and I could no longer see the edges of the town, as if the world had closed in, trapping me there. And then I saw them for the first time, shadows at the end of the street, dozens of them standing perfectly still, human shapes but too tall, their arms dangling longer than they should, and their heads tilted in unison as if they were watching me with faces I could not make out. And the whispers turned into a low hum that vibrated in my bones, and every instinct I had screamed to run, So I sprinted down the street, back toward my car, my shoes slapping the pavement so loudly it echoed like a gunshot. But when I reached the spot where I had parked, my car was gone, the space empty except for deep black marks burned into the ground like it had been swallowed whole. My chest heaved, my throat burned, and I turned wildly, looking for another way out. But the streets seemed to stretch longer than they had before, twisting into angles that should not exist. In every direction I turned, more shadows appeared, closer this time, their movements wrong, jerking like broken marionettes. And I could hear them breathing though they had no mouths. I ran toward the school at the edge of town, my only thought to find somewhere to hide. But when I pushed through the double doors, the hallway lights flickered, and lockers stood wide open with belongings spilling out as if children had vanished mid-step. And on the chalkboard of the nearest classroom someone had written in jagged letters, "The bell takes us all," over and over again until the chalk had snapped. I stumbled back, clutching the doorframe, and heard the sound of children laughing faintly behind me though the room was empty. And in the reflection of the glass window, I saw something move behind me, a tall shadow gliding without sound. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I backed out of the school, trembling, and made my way toward the edge of town. But I realized with dawning horror that the further I walked, the more the streets looped back, turning me around without my knowing, bringing me back to the square where the church bell tower loomed like a sentinel, and the whispers now were deafening. A chorus of voices begging, crying, chanting, and I covered my ears, but it made no difference. The sound was inside me, vibrating in my skull, and then the bell rang. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, low and booming yet sharp enough to pierce through my chest. And with that single toll, the shadows began to move toward me, gliding closer, their arms stretching out, and their faces became clear in the moonlight. And I felt bile rise in my throat because they were not strangers. They were the faces of the people whose belongings I had seen, the families, the children, the waitresses at the diner. Their eyes hollow, their mouths frozen open, their skin gray and stretched thin like paper, and they reached for me with hands that trembled, whispering through lips that did not move. I turned and ran again, my legs burning, my lungs on fire, but no matter where I went, the bell rang again, and with each toll more of them appeared, until the streets were filled with their silent march, until I could hardly breathe, until the world itself seemed to collapse inward, and the fog consumed everything except me. I found myself back at the church, the doors yawning open like a mouth, and I knew I had nowhere else to go, so I staggered inside, the whispers crashing over me like waves, and I looked up at the mural again, and this time the painted figure was no longer still. Its hands shifted, the strings of people swaying, and I felt something tug at my arms, invisible strings pulling me upward, and I screamed, but the sound was swallowed instantly, drowned in the bell's toll. The last thing I remember was the feeling of my body leaving the ground, my limbs jerking as though I was no longer in control, and I saw my reflection in the glass of a broken window, my face stretched pale, my mouth hanging open, my eyes hollowing out into black pits, and the whispers filled me completely, erasing every thought, every fear, every piece of me, until I understood what had happened in Marowak, why the town had disappeared in a single night. Because it had not been abandoned, it had been taken, pulled into something beyond this world, bound to the bell, bound to the figure in the mural, bound forever. And as my consciousness faded into the hum of countless voices, I realized I was no longer alone. I was part of them now, another shadow in the fog, waiting for the next traveler to stumble in, because the town is still there, hidden in the mist, waiting, always waiting, and no one who enters will ever leave again.